population and community ecology. Nature exists at several levels, uh, the individual being the bottom level, and then the population is composed of all the individuals of the same species that live in a particular area at a given time. And then you've got a community, which is all your living organisms within a given area. Um, and when you've got terrestrial ecosystems that have similar living organisms in them, especially the plants with similar growth forms, that's called a biome. Communities exist within an ecosystem, which consists of all the living and non-living components in a particular ecosystem. And then the biosphere incorporates all of Earth's ecosystems. The California condor was nearly extinct with only 22 birds left in the wild. The remaining birds were captured and bred in captivity. As of 2009, there were 348 birds in the wild. A major threat still remains to the bird due to lead used in ammunition. When the birds eat carcasses, lead poisoning can make them very weak, which was the original demise of the population. Populations are constantly changing. If inputs exceed outputs, the population will grow. If outputs exceed inputs, the population will eventually go extinct. Population size is calculated by subtracting outputs from the population. That would be deaths and emigration, or individuals exiting the area, from inputs to the population, which are births and immigration, or individuals moving into the area. The study of factors that cause populations to increase or decrease is known as population ecology. Knowing the factors that affect a species' population size can help us ensure survival of small populations or to control large populations. Populations change in size, density, sex ratio, and age distribution. Population size is the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area, or in the case of aquatic organisms, it's per volume. Knowing a population's density and its size can help scientists predict whether a species is rare or abundant. And population density also helps scientists to determine if a population in a location is so dense that it might outstrip its food supply. Wildlife managers divide game species into management zones. More hunting or fishing permits might be offered in zones with higher densities of populations. Population distribution is a description of how individuals are distributed with respect to one another. Three general patterns of population distribution occur in a habitat. They are clumping, uniform distribution, and random dispersion. Most species live in clumps or groups for some or all of the following factors. The availability of resources varies from place to place. Living in groups offers better protection from predators. Some predator species live in packs to have a better chance of getting a meal, or temporary groups may form for mating and caring for young. Uniform pattern distribution is common among territorial animals and plants that produce chemical toxins that actually keep other plants from growing near them. The sex ratio of a population is the ratio of males to females. Because the number of offspring produced is a function of how many females are in a population, knowing a population's sex ratio helps scientists estimate the number of offspring in the next generation. A population's age structure is a description of how many individuals fit into particular age categories. Knowing a population's age structure helps ecologists predict how rapidly a population can grow. Some species have a low intrinsic growth rate, and their abundance is determined by the carrying capacity of the environment. And these are called K-selected species, where K is the variable for the carrying capacity on a graph of population size. Traits of K-selected species include large organisms, organisms that reach reproductive maturity relatively late in life. They have few large offspring, and they provide substantial care to the parental care to the offspring. Our selected species, on the other hand, have a high intrinsic growth rate because they reproduce often and produce large numbers of offspring. Our selected species do not remain near their carrying capacity, but exhibit cycles of overshoots and die-offs. Traits of our selected species include small organisms, reach reproductive maturity relatively early in life, reproduce frequently and have many small offspring, provide little or no parental care. Most species fall somewhere in between these two extremes and exhibit combinations of traits from each type. Survivorship curves are species distinct patterns of survival over time. A type 1 survivorship curve has a high survival rate throughout most of the species' lifespan, with large numbers of die-offs as they approach old age. So these tend to be K-selected species. Type 2 survivorship curves have a relatively constant decline in survivorship throughout the species' lifespans. And then type 3 survivorship curves have a low survivorship early in life, with few individuals reaching adulthood, and these tend to be R-selected species. Population growth models are mathematical equations that can be used to predict population size at any moment in time. The growth rate of a population is the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given time period, minus the deaths of the individual or its offspring during the same period. Intrinsic growth rate is the maximum potential for growth of a population under ideal conditions if they have unlimited resources available to them. So that would be a high number of births and a low number of deaths. Under less than ideal conditions, when resources are limited, the population's growth rate will be lower than its intrinsic growth rate because individuals will have fewer offspring and the number of deaths will increase. Under ideal conditions, the future size of the population depends on the current size of the population, the intrinsic growth rate of the population, and the amount of time over which the population grows. The exponential growth model describes a continuously increasing population that grows at a fixed rate. The logistic growth model describes a population whose growth is initially exponential, but slows as the population approaches the carrying capacity of the environment. As the population size nears half of the carrying capacity, the population's growth begins to slow. The population stops growing as it approaches the carrying capacity of the environment. The logistic growth model produces an S-shaped curve when it is graphed, and the logistics growth model is used to predict the growth of populations that are subject to density-dependent constraints. And there's our S-shaped growth curve. Carrying capacities can fluctuate seasonally or from year to year. Exponential growth leads to logistic growth and may lead to population overshooting the environment's carrying capacity if there is less food available than needed to feed the offspring. Overshooting environment's resources often is a result of a reproductive time lag. The reproductive time lag can produce a die-off or population crash of organisms unless the organisms can find resources or move to an area with more resources. The population will drop below carrying capacity and oscillate around the carrying capacity and approach it over time. 4 general types of population fluctuations in nature are stable, eruptive, cyclic, and irregular. A stable population fluctuates slightly above and below carrying capacity and is characteristic of many species living under fairly constant environmental conditions. Some species have a fairly stable population that may occasionally erupt to a high peak and then crash to below carrying capacity. This is the characteristic of short-lived, rapidly reproducing species. Cyclic fluctuations occur over a regular time period, generally a multiple year cycle, and you generally see that with like predator and prey interactions. Humans are not exempt from population crashes. Examples include the Irish potato famine, the bubonic plague, and the current AIDS epidemic. Density-dependent factors have a greater effect on the population as its density increases. Food availability is an example of a density-dependent population control. A limiting resource is a resource that a population cannot live without and which occurs in quantities lower than the population would require to increase in size. At low population densities, each individual has access to sufficient quantities of the limiting resources, survives, and reproduces so the population grows quickly. At high population densities, individuals receive a smaller share, fewer survive, and the survivors produce less offspring, so the population grows slowly. The limit to how many individuals an environment will sustain due to a limiting resource is called the carrying capacity. Environmental resistance is all factors that limit the growth of a population and largely determine an area's carrying capacity. Density-independent factors affect a population size regardless of density. Tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, fires, volcanic eruptions, and other climatic events are examples of density-independent factors.